Well, I'm just going to welcome everybody to this pre-conference Web Science Institute seminar. We're going to wait a minute just to see if any more people arrive, and then we'll start. I can see that people are coming in as we speak. Okay, I think we'll start. So hello and welcome to everybody who's joined us online, and a very special thank you and welcome to our panelists, Professor Sinan Aral from MIT Sloan School of Management, Damian Collins MP, who's a UK parliamentarian, and Dr. Charles Kriel, who's a researcher, writer, and filmmaker, whose film People You May Know inspired me to organise this debate. Their biographies are all on the website, so I'm not going to dwell too long on who they all are. If you have any questions, do please put them in the Q&A and I will see them. I'm going to kick off this panel on the power of social media by asking each panelist in turn to tell us when, which year and why, when did they first realize that social media and the web was going to be so transformative, both in positive and negative ways, and what did they do with it, do with their insight? And I'm going to ask Sinan to start.
Sure. So thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. So for me, it all started in actually the year 2001, 3 years before Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook. And I was a graduate student at MIT studying for two different classes, one on statistics and one on sociology. And the statistics class kept repeating the assumption of many statistical models, which is known as IID, that the observations in our data are independent and identically distributed, which means that we were assuming that people in our data sets, companies in our data sets, organizations in our data sets were not related to each other in any way. They were independent. And in my sociology class, we were studying networks. We were studying how much dramatic interdependence there is in the world. And at the time, really, we didn't have that many social networking sites, but there were sites like Friendster and nascent sites. MySpace was just coming up. And I thought to myself, wow, a lot of the variance, a lot of the unknown in our models that assume that everything is independent can probably be explained by the actual dramatic interdependence amongst us all in the information that we share over digital media. And so what did I do? I directed my entire PhD thesis into studying how information sharing in online social networks affects outcomes. And I have dedicated the last 20 years of research to it, culminating in this book, The Hype Machine, which describes what we've learned researching Facebook, Snapchat, WeChat, Instagram, for the last 20 years, from the spread of fake news, which we published in Science magazine in 2018, a big study, all the way through to effects on elections and democracy, how it affects public health outcomes like the spread of coronavirus and measles. And I try to summarize it in this book.
Thank you. Damian, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be with you on this panel. I think for me, the key moment came more recently, and that was in 2017. That's what I was chair of the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Subcommittee. We decided sort of late that year that we would do, or we started an inquiry on disinformation and fake news, which would run for about 18 months. And I think we did that because I think we were getting increasingly interested in the analysis of the 2016 presidential election, particularly actually before we got interested in things like the Russians buying ads on Facebook. What I think was interesting was the idea that disinformation stories, fake news stories, were getting a bigger audience than some of the most popular news stories. People couldn't tell the difference, and people were increasingly using social media, not just as a method for connecting with friends, but actually to get news from. So if a source where about a third of people in the UK get their news has got more fake news than real news, and people can't tell the difference, then that's a problem. You know, that starts to become a big problem. And you start to recognize that social media is not just a tool, it could be people's experience of the web. And then when we started that inquiry, the Cambridge Analytica affair sort of blew up. And that demonstrated two things for me. One was that the tech companies weren't always very honest about what they were doing and what they weren't doing, what the mistakes were. And that the problem of bad content like fake news wasn't just a content problem. When we started the investigation, that was how I saw it. It was a bit like you know, pirated films and or you know, other sort of harmful images that it was bad content. We wanted the companies to take it down. Actually, what that period brought home to me was how much of the design of social media is responsible for the way in which content spreads, and it's the systems that have been created by the companies, which are just as important, if not more important, than just what people post. And I think that, for me, that inquiry was the part of that journey. I should also mention, before Charles speaks too, it was because we did that inquiry that I met Charles. At the very start of it, I didn't want this to be one of those inquiries where we sat as parliamentarians, not properly briefed on what to ask the tech companies. We wanted to know where their weak spots were, what they were trying to hide. And so we had a succession of panels with academics coming to talk to us. And Charles came and gave evidence. And I turned to the clerk of the committee and I said, we've got to hire that person. That was when things started to get interesting.
Okay, I think segue. You're on mute, Charles.
I said, you don't mind if I put that on my CV, do you, Damian?
Not at all.
I think you're next then.
Well, thanks. And thank you for having me. And it's really great to be here with Sinan and Damian. I'm honored by that. My journey on this oddly parallels both Sinan and Damian's, in that I first became aware of this around the turn of the millennium, as did Sinan, when there were things like Friendster and MySpace coming up. And what I was seeing is both a combination of people trying to, people beginning to lead what we would ultimately call the quantified life, where we were actually measuring our number of friends and measuring our number of contacts and comparing those numbers with other people in order to understand just how much social power it is that we might have. Now, simultaneous to that, I had a career at Radio 1 where I was DJing and VJing at the time, at the turn of the millennium. And what I was seeing in culture was this idea that people were beginning to project their personalities by what it was that they collected and then presented to other people. And it was kind of the arrogation of the DJ and the arrogation of the curator within our society, and curators became more important than artists, and DJs became more important than people who were producing music. And the combination of that with this kind of quantification of your social status began mixing up in my brain together. And I could see that something profound was about to change within society, and it would only happen as a networked effect. And then the second big realization was, in fact, after watching Brexit happen, I wrote a paper questioning whether, well, basically saying that Cambridge Analytica had everything to do with Brexit, and presented that as evidence to the select committee, and came in and ultimately ended up advising Damian's committee. And so it became a big part of my thinking and my life again, but in a much less ambiguous way than the earlier approach. But I just have to add to that I think that most of what it is that we're seeing now, what we saw at the turn of millennium, what we've seen in the interim, a lot of that has been predicted by critical theory. And for quite some time. And we've seen it in the literature of critical theory and the literature that has surrounded the creation of and manifestation of the internet. And in journals like Rhizome and the writing of the Croakers, but even writers before that. And I think all of that's really important and isn't quite being referred to enough now in our dialogues around these issues, probably because we're trying to deal with practicalities. But the actual structure of the issues that we're facing have long been predicted.
That's really interesting. And if you get some time, you should post some links to those in our Q&A for people to read. I know I'm the chair, but I'm going to tell you my aha moments as well. It was also in 2001, and I had been a television executive, making normal television, commissioning factual programs for BBC One and BBC Two. And in about 1998, I jumped ship and joined the BBC's innovation think tank because our boss, Lord John Burt, realised the internet was coming and we had to change very, very fast. So I was sent, in fact, to the Media Lab, to Palo Alto, to visit all sorts of people, to see all sorts of things. But only in 2001, I went to Los Angeles for a conference, and strangely, I actually cannot remember the name of the conference, which is sad, but I was staying at a friend's house on their spare bed in their office, and I couldn't sleep because of the jet lag, and I picked two books that looked very inviting out of her shelf, and one was called The Quark and the Jaguar by Murray Gellein, and the other was called Emergence, and by Stephen Johnson. And I read those books all night. And after that, when I went home, I thought, my God, we just think it's content at the BBC. We just think it's content, but it's going to be so much more. And that was really, really influential for me. And luckily, I was in that room on that night. So, having introduced ourselves, as I said earlier, this panel was inspired by my watching a documentary last year, because I'm a member of BAFTA and I have to watch a lot of films. And although I feel as a professor in digital media, I know a lot about social media, I know quite a bit about the hype machine, although I've been allergic to digital marketing until I read this book and it was all explained to me, that this documentary was the only thing I'd ever seen that the public could see, apart from attending maybe a DCMS select committee, which not many members of the public would do, that began to explain how social media can radicalize people, activate them, make them behave differently and do things. And I wonder, Charles, if you could briefly tell us a bit about what your film uncovered.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's both my film, I'm co-director with Katharine Gellein, and we co-directed, but she produced the film. It's called People You May Know. You can find it on Amazon Prime, or you may well have watched it before we started here. The film began as documentation of the journey with the DCMS Select Committee. And about the time that we wrapped that up, I decided to pick up a thread that had been brought to us by one of the witnesses, Chris Vickery, and follow that and pursue a further investigation in the United States, because although I'm based in Europe, I'm an American and I'm from Alabama in the Deep South and so on. And so I was very interested in what Vickery brought in, and he talked about American churches. And ultimately, what we found is that the Koch brothers, who are a powerful force in American right-wing politics, had commissioned a software company to work with Cambridge Analytica to create a platform to allow American churches to target people who were suffering from addiction, who were going through grief, who might be under financial duress, might have mental and emotional issues, and recruit them into church-based programs and ultimately recruit them into the church. But at the same time, what they were doing is they were recruiting them and weaponizing them for the politics of the far right. And I feel comfortable calling it the far right because it's American politics of exclusion of groups, exclusion on a number of different levels. And so we chased this down and we found all the evidence for it and ultimately uncovered a massive operation by an organization called the Council for National Policy. And it seemed like a ridiculous idea a year ago, even after we'd made the film and I was describing it. But now, after watching what happened on January 6th, it seems like a perfectly reasonable idea that people who are vulnerable are being specifically targeted online for their vulnerabilities in order to leverage them for extremist politics.
Thank you very much. It is a really good watch, but as I said before, you need quite a stiff drink to watch it with. I don't know if you feel, Charles, and I'll open this to Damian as well before going back to Sinan, that could happen here in the UK. I don't mean in terms of targeting churchgoers, because I don't think we attend church in anything like the numbers that you do in the States. But with any other groups, do you feel that could happen here?
Absolutely, and I'm certain that it is happening. You know, Facebook doesn't operate that differently in Europe than it does in the United States, nor do most of the social media networks. And so the marketing and the kind of very specific marketing that you can do to people and the inferred data that you can produce around people's mental health, and in fact, people's mental health data is fairly available and fair game. When I watch anti-lockdown protests on Trafalgar Square, I feel like I'm watching precursor or, in fact, the January 6th insurrection. I feel like while there are people there who genuinely are against the lockdown, there are also a lot of people there who are not well and have been targeted because of their vulnerabilities.
Yes, I felt that particular demonstration showed the first signs for me of sort of import behavior from the USA. So I do think it's happening. Damian, do you feel, having chaired the select committee and now having interviewed everybody there is to interview on Infotagion, your podcast, do you feel that, I can only talk about the UK for the moment, in the UK with the framing of the online harms legislation, that we have a handle on the depth of the situation?
Yes, I think we do. And what I would say about the online harms, online safety bill, as it's going to be called, is that I think the most important thing that bill does is that it starts to build the infrastructure, the governmental infrastructure we'll need to deal with these problems in the future. And it does that in a couple of important ways. Firstly, it gives a regulator the power to audit companies. So, for example, you might take the Stop the Steal campaign, the insurrection in Washington on the 6th of January. The Facebook Oversight Board can look at individual posts, almost like they're printed out on a piece of paper. They might as well be printed out on a piece of paper. It's about as technically advanced as what they're doing. They're looking at it and they're saying, should that have been there or not? Should that have been taken down or not? Was that incitement or was it not? What they're not allowed to do, and in fact they asked to do, but were told they couldn't do, was to say, well, okay, well, actually, is the problem here? It's not just the content exists, but that data is being used to promote that content to the people that are most likely to want to join in. So if I'm organizing an insurrection on Facebook, I can make sure the people most likely to want to join the insurrection are the people that know the most about it. And Facebook tools help me do that. It's the same system that I think is being used to target problem gamblers with gambling promotions. It's the same tech that is being used to target teenage girls with images and content that might lead to self-harm and self-abuse. This is the routine day-to-day experience of the internet. Whether you are a QAnon conspiracy theorist or you are a 14-year-old on TikTok, your day is driven and shaped by your data profile and the content which is recommended to you in order to get you there. So if we can have a regulator that's got the right to peer behind the curtain, to actually see, well, how do these data systems work? Is the problem your recommendation tools as much as it is the content people post? That's a very important step. The second aspect of it, and it's a sort of peculiarly British or English common law aspect of the bill, which is the concept of duty of care. Now, this exists in other areas of the law, which is to say that there are certain standards we expect you to meet. We don't necessarily have to specify exactly what all of them are, but we know what, but actually if you fall below them, you could become liable. In the same way that a construction company operating a building site has a duty of care to the safety of the people that work on it. The legislation doesn't spell out all the things they have to do, but we know what negligent looks like. We know what poor practice looks like. And what this bill will do is something similar, which is to say there are certain standards we expect you to meet. We want you to satisfy the regulator. You've got systems in place to deal with and remove harmful content when it's posted. But if something comes along which may not have been spelled out in black and white in the bill, but is of a similar nature, the regulator can still take action on that as well. So it'd be impossible to create legislation which anticipates every single bad thing that could happen. But we can expect standards to be enforced on companies. So that combination of the standards we expect of the companies and the ability to investigate whether they're meeting those standards or not and audit them is very important. I believe once this is established, all that we will ever do is add to it. We won't get it right first time, and it will evolve, and new challenges will come along. But for the first time, we'll have ended the idea that companies like Facebook are the passive observers of what happens on their systems, that they are actually active participants, and they have a responsibility because they are active participants. And indeed, they make money out of a lot of this behavior too.
Okay, I'm going to come to Sinan in just a minute, but while I've got you on the platform, Damian, ask, because I listened to the podcast with the minister and who's taking it through, and I was slightly concerned by two things. One was the idea that because we have other legislation that deals with incitement to racial hatred, or other legislation that might deal with fraud, or other legislation that deals with any number of the types of problem that can emerge through the hype machine or through the internet, will the big tech companies not be able to kind of wriggle through this sort of rather sort of wide net?
This is a good question, and I think it's a sense of what does incitement mean in the internet age. I think is what it boils down to. So even if we take a very American view of incitement, which exists as a limit on free speech in America. So the idea that First Amendment is totally absolute, you can say anything you like, is not the case. It's a clear, imminent, credible threat against an individual person. That they're like that they may become a victim, or that an individual person may be inspired to commit a criminal act as a consequence of something what someone said. But what if we said actually the issue with something like Stop the Steal in America and the 6th of January insurrection was actually, it wasn't about a moment. It wasn't one thing one person said at one time directed at a person which caused something to happen. It was an effect over a period of months, and where people were being taken down a path which led to this big event happening. And at what point then do you stop? What point do you then say, no, this is a problem, someone's got to do something about it? At what point do we then say to Facebook, you were negligent because you didn't act sooner? Is it when the first person is killed at an event? Is that when everything has to stop? Or do we say, actually, no, it's before then, it's when people are gathering on the day and it looks nasty? Or do we say, actually, there's an effect happening here which is likely to lead to a situation which could cause harm? Now, an issue that gets discussed a lot in the UK at the moment is racial abuse of sports people, particularly footballers. Now, is it more likely that race crimes will be committed, probably because this abuse exists on social media? Yes, I think it probably is. And in fact, race crime in the UK has gone up in the last year quite significantly. Is that cause and effect? It's not directly, and the legal definition of incitement doesn't quite help us here because it's not necessarily directed at a person. And even if it is, that might not be the person that gets being attacked, but does it make it more likely? And I think these are the difficult areas. At what point do you say, actually, this pattern of behavior was likely to lead to someone being killed or some terrible crime being committed? But at what point should you intervene to stop that happening? And what are the consequences? Donald Trump has got a 2-year ban from Facebook because if more people had died in Washington, would he have got longer? I mean, it's kind of bizarre sort of conversation to be having, but I think this is what we need to understand: is when should you intervene? What should the penalties be? And I think that the definition that has been created in law of incitement and when you can act, I don't think helps us for a social media age where the issue could be people are seeing thousands of posts on the same subject over many months, and that has a radicalizing effect on them. I mean, I think we'd all agree. I think you look at QAnon, you look at conspiracies around COVID, there's no doubt that the kind of drip by drip, day by day effect, I think radicalizes opinion. And it's hard to point at that one post that says that was the moment it happened. So I think the bill gives us flexibility to think about this, and having a regulator that can interpret the bill and develop a code for the companies to follow is helpful in dealing with this. But I think it's probably one of the hardest bits of this to get right.
Sinan, I know that in your book you have proposed many possible levers and changes that could be pulled. And obviously you're in the USA, what do you think of the legislative route versus the engineering, social persuasion route, or any other route?
Well, I mean, I think this is such a complex problem that we need all of these oars rowing in the same direction at once. There's no one silver bullet that's going to solve the social media crisis. In my book, I describe what I think are the key 4 levers, which I call the money, code, norms, and laws. Money being the business models of the platforms that, as Damian is saying, incentivizes the platforms to favor profits over people. Code is the design of the platforms and the algorithms that diffuse the information and target the information at various people. Norms are the way we as ordinary citizens adopt and use the technology. There's no reason we need to adopt the technology to bully others, for example. And finally, laws, which you're asking me about, is regulation. And I go into depth on regulation in the book. And I think that there are a number of things that we have to address when it comes to regulation. And I'm following it and participating in it closely here in the United States, as well as with my European colleagues. The first entry ticket to solving this crisis from a regulatory perspective is creating competition. Right now, there's not competition in the social media economy, which means that there's no incentive for the companies to change because they're making profits hand over fist, and we have no choice. If you want to speak to your friends and family over social media, you only have a few choices right now, and that's because there isn't competition and there isn't regulation that ensures competition. Now, as an economist, when I study social media, what I notice is that the social media economy runs on network effects, which means that the value of a platform is a function of the number of people on the platform. And so the more people there are on Facebook, the harder it is to leave Facebook. And so what you need to create competition are structural reforms to the social media economy itself. What do I mean by that? You need interoperability legislation and social network and data portability legislation, which will give consumers choices in which networks they join in order to get access to their friends and family to have communications with them. Right now, we can't leave Facebook because that's the only place where our friends and family are to talk to, or Instagram or Twitter. But if I could join a brand new social network that favors privacy, that cleans content, that reduces manipulation and bullying, and I could message my friends on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere through such a platform, then I would choose that platform over Facebook and Twitter that haven't done enough to quell hate speech, to reduce the spread of misinformation, and to protect my privacy. But I can't do that because I won't be able to speak to my friends and family. Now, people say, oh, wow, that sounds really hard. But imagine if you couldn't send a text message from one cell phone provider to another, say Verizon to Sprint here in the United States. You would think that's ridiculous. And we have instituted by law in the United States, for example, with the Time Warner merger, that when AOL merged with Time Warner, that the AOL Instant Messenger was required to become interoperable with MSN Messenger and Yahoo Messenger. They went from 65% market share to 59% a year later to 55% 2 years after that. Then they ceded the entire market to new entrants in 3 years. That's what interoperability can do to create competition. Once we have competition and choice for consumers, we have to deal with the line between free and harmful speech. In the United States, that means talking about repeal or reform of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I think repeal is a disaster for the free internet, but we need reform that makes companies liable and makes companies accountable to the content on their platforms. Then we have to deal with the spread of misinformation, which I don't think requires a regulatory approach, but requires a industry-based approach, because it takes changes to the algorithms, it takes changes to the platforms. That can be bolstered by having liability for the content that comes through the platforms, as I talked about earlier. So there are a number of different things we can do in a regulatory framework. starting with competition, moving to speech, and so on. But regulation is not the only lever. We also have to think about the design of the platforms, the way we adopt and use these platforms, and also the business model. So you see Twitter now coming with a subscription model that might reduce the reliance on targeted advertising, which is a big driver of a lot of the harms that we see in social media. My friend Paul Romer, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, has advocated taxing targeted advertising as a deterrent and a forcing function to switch platforms away from targeted advertising towards other freemium and subscription models. All of these solutions need to be working in concert if we hope to have any real impact on the problems that we're seeing in social media.
And to follow that, do you feel any one jurisdiction can take this on, or how do you feel it? Do you feel coordination is possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that legislatures are the starting point. And the reason for that is because legislatures are, you know, the European parliaments and the Congress of the United States are the most deliberative and representative bodies of government that we have. I don't believe, for example, in the United States, that the executive branch is the right place to be regulating social media, because frequently these are politically appointed commissions like the FTC and the FCC in the United States. And the problem is that the questions that we're answering are highly politicized. So here in the US, you see very different opinions from the right and the left on questions of, for example, reform of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. When you let the executive branch here in the United States lead, it creates politicization of the issue, whereas legislatures can create more deliberative and representative change. And I think that's going to be much more sustainable in the long run.
Well, Damian, it's all up to you then.
Well, I think what we're seeing now, and this is a very big change from 2018 even, and we've come a long way from, you know, the senator we run ads, you know, exchange in the Senate, you know, where you're seeing now sort of, you know, committees in parliaments around the world are very switched on these issues. Many members who now know quite a lot about this subject. You know, various legal actions around the world involving tech companies as well, you know, which are competition authorities and regulators around the world taking a much more active interest in the business model of tech companies. And you know, so we are seeing a shift. There's no doubt about that. And I think lots of very interesting proposals coming out of America. Very interesting picks from Joe Biden as well for some of the key tech roles of people who would be considered to be, you know, not tech skeptics, but people that are willing to challenge the companies on these issues around data usage and abuse of market power. We're seeing that in the UK through the Online Safety Bill and the Competition and Markets Authority Digital Markets Unit. We're seeing it in the EU. And so I think, you know, we're going through a moment of change where I think what's happening to the tech sector is what's happened to many other big industries over the years, is that they grow very fast, and there comes a point where governments intervene and regulators intervene to say, okay, well, who's enforcing standards here? Are the companies doing it themselves, or should it be someone more neutral? And I think that's the process we're going through now.
Okay. Although I come from an editorial background, I have to say I am much more interested in the capacity of these networks to influence elections and takeovers of other countries. And I have some roots in the Ukraine. I've been dying to go there for years to trace some ancestry, and I can't go. There's a war going on, and not to speak lightly of it, with the potential for the Ukraine to enter NATO and Joe Biden talking to Putin. Where do you think we can best influence, or you can best influence, a realpolitik of security, international relations, soft and hard diplomacy, when it comes to not just educating people in place as to how it works, but actually helping them counter some of the attacks that are going on? I'll just throw that open, actually. I think.
Well, just very briefly, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that Ukraine, for example, is the hot lab for online social influence, and especially for malign foreign actors operating there. The people who are both operating there, but also amplifying messaging from outside are very sophisticated in the way that they use online media. And there are powerful operations from the EU, the UK, the US, all in Ukraine right now, just as there are from Russia. There's a lot of activity there. So I think we're all very influential there now.
Good.
Yeah, I think I think we should also just look, continue to think about these things as the Russians do as well. For them, these things are connected. The use of information warfare to destabilize other countries, to create division, is part of a strategy, and that's why you see in different around the world, Russia taking an interest in these issues. And actually, if we were to step back and look at what's happening, and the insurrection in Washington is something we've already talked about, but what you see as well is these information campaigns, this information warfare, is being used ultimately to pick away at the very fabric of democracy itself. And indeed, it is now not an unusual thing to hear people with a public position in America, not necessarily in government or in elected office, but people who have a public position, sort of actively discussing the idea of a sort of second American Revolution, as a means to restore the nation's pride. I mean, that is extraordinary, and I think we should not believe that this is just a few crackpots.
Yeah.
We need to take it a lot more seriously than that.
Sinan, in your book, sorry to cut across you. In your book, you tell the story of someone in Russia who started a social network that became very, very popular, and his eventual fight with the authorities. I think that is highly unknown to most people. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind repeating some of it here and sharing your thoughts about how the toings and throwings of sort of maybe activist coders or people who don't necessarily go along with things can or can't influence change.
Well, I mean, there are a number of stories relevant to this conversation in the book. The book opens with the story of Crimea, which is really the first time that we saw the now open secret of Russian interference in geopolitical events through social media. And we conducted a 10-year study of the spread of fake news online, where we had access to the entire Twitter historical archive. So we studied every tweet that was ever tweeted from 2006 to 2016. We published this on the cover of Science in the year 2018. Now, we didn't publish all of the data or all of the results in that paper, but we did find in that paper that fake news travels farther, faster, deeper, more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied. But when I went back to write the book, I investigated the Crimean annexation. And what happened in Crimea was absolutely stunning. And it mirrors exactly what Damian is talking about. And the book, in the book, I predicted that there would be violence after the election in the United States. That was also very predictable. I didn't think that was going out on a limb by any stretch of the imagination. But in Crimea, what happened was two things happened. One, Russian-related institutions and organizations spread false abuse reports to Facebook and other platforms to shut down pro-Ukrainian bloggers that were talking about Crimea, and to have them wiped off of Facebook, claiming that they were posting porn or hate speech. And they would get thousands of these abuse reports automatically generated about any pro-Ukrainian blogger, just to silence one side of the conversation. The other prong of the strategy was to create and spread fake news. And when we looked into our Twitter data, we found that the largest spike of mixed news, which is true news mixed with false news, in the same story, the largest spike and greater than any other spike by a factor of 4 over 10 years happened in the 2 months of the Crimean annexation. And what we found was that the top stories were being parroted almost verbatim by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, at speeches at the UN and so on. And so the whole concept that this is some sort of clandestine activity is transparent in the sense that it's not possible for the fake news stories to be almost identical to the words coming out of Sergei Lavrov's mouth on the same day at the UN, and then to have these stories being posted by fake accounts that were created the day before, going viral in 3 different languages when they had no followers the day before. This is clear signs of an orchestrated effort to frame the reality for the international community and for citizens of Crimea at the same time. And think about why that's relevant. Well, if it's an annexation by Russia, then NATO surely has to respond to that. But if it can be framed as an accession that Crimean citizens overwhelmingly want to join Russia, then you get the Obama doctrine, which is sanctions, not intervention. And by the way, that's the first time in the post-war era that sovereign boundaries have been redrawn to that extent. And it's like a sovereignty switched like a light switch overnight. The information war is an essential part of that annexation. The story you're asking me about is about Pavel Durov and the creation of Telegram. And one thing that I noted in the Q&A, and then I'll stop talking, is that the encrypted platforms like Telegram and WhatsApp and so on are particularly important to consider because they're very difficult to monitor or to understand what's going on in those platforms. Because the messages are targeted and encrypted, it's hard to know who's seeing what misinformation, how it's being targeted at whom, and therefore to even get a real handle on the problem.
Does that mean you're against the encrypted services?
Absolutely not. I think that encryption and anonymity are important elements of a free society, but we have to also have stopgap solutions that enable us to reduce harm in those areas. So for a great example is that once it became known that public health misinformation like anti-vaccine misinformation was spreading on WhatsApp, WhatsApp read our paper that showed that falsity spread 6 times faster than the truth. And what they did was they reduced the number of reshares of articles to 5 and then to 1, just to slow all information down across the board to give the truth a chance to catch up with falsity. So there are ways that you can create an encrypted platform that defavors falsity in a sense, or allows the truth to at least catch up to falsity. And there are a number of other things that we can do. I don't believe we should just ban encryption or force universal identification online or anything like that. I think that there are important reasons, for example, in authoritarian countries where encryption can protect minority opinions. And I think that that's important as well.
Okay. We have 15 minutes left. And before I ask if there are any questions from our audience, I wanted to ask 2 things. First of all, I wanted to ask Charles to tell us where his investigations have taken him and Katharine. What film are you making now? And does it still deal with this same area of inquiry?
I'm gonna let Katharine weigh in on that if she's there.
I don't know if she's there. I'm going to have to ask. Can you put your camera on?
Yay. Here we go. Hello.
So Katharine is the producer with Charles of The People You May Know film that we talked about.
And co-director.
And co-director, excuse me.
Hi, everyone. Yes, the film that we're currently making is called Disinformed. And it was interesting. One of the things that came up earlier was this idea of, can you bring people back from the brink of disinformation, of conspiracy theory? And that's a large part of what we're trying to address in this one. People you may know started with the radicalization path through social media and people who are actively encouraging it. And now we're trying to listen to people and find out whether, can you de-radicalize? Is there any way of meeting people? And Charles, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what we're finding.
Sure. So a lot of what we're looking at is how part of it is about how Q has penetrated communities that we didn't expect them to penetrate, like health, yoga, wellness communities, communities that would traditionally be more left, and we tend to think of Q as a function of the right, but it's really a function of radicalization. And so whatever issue you choose to radicalize around, and then to understand better who is vulnerable, why they're vulnerable, and then how it is that they're being preyed upon, and they really are being preyed upon, and then that there's an incredible profit motive behind this, not only at the level of big data corporations or big social media corporations, but just at the level of somebody who wants to sell cheap pills and say that they'll cure COVID. Somebody who would like to see their book on health and wellness and anti-masking and anti-vaxxing make the bestseller list. So there's a lot of profiteering that's going on within this situation, and it all contributes to the overall problems that Damian and the rest of us have to solve, which is how do we counter this mass misinformation environment. This is one of 3 films that we're making that are about contemporary power and the manipulation of power. There's Disinformed, there's People You May Know, and then there's another book, another film that we're working on and have shot most of, called The 25%, which is about psychopathy in everyday life and people who create toxic environments. And that's from a very local environment, say within a family or a company, to creating toxic environments like social networks.
Well, and what we found with Disinformed, of course, is, we've long said that the social media platforms need to be regulated, and they're at fault for that. But of course, they're only making money from whichever content is keeping you on the platform. So you can get radicalized just by going down a YouTube rabbit hole. But the people, there are some concerted efforts behind this, like people who are, like Charles says, making money off of specific things like anti-vax content. And they don't necessarily believe in it themselves. They're just feeding this content because it's what has people clicking, especially during a pandemic.
Well, Sinan has many good examples of such practice in his book. I don't know if you want to add anything to what they've said.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things. I think this idea of how do you bring people back, really important idea. Great that you're making a film about it. I think this is the sort of like the next big question. And 2 items from the book that talk about this. One, we did a very large experiment on Spotify about polarization. And one of the key elements of polarization is this idea that the recommendation algorithms will feed you more of what they think you want. And so will send you down these quote unquote rabbit holes of similar and then radicalized content. And what we found was we did an experiment on the recommendation engine of Spotify for podcasts. And in the experiment, we randomly assigned some people to receive recommendations based on what they had listened to in the past, and others to receive recommendations based on just what was popular. And what we found was that the recommendation that was based on your prior listening history did indeed narrow you're listening and create these sort of filter bubbles where you are sort of more narrowly listening to the same type of content and that is different from the other types of content that you might have listened to. But relevant to this question of how do you bring people back, when we turned the recommendation engine off, what we saw is that people's natural desire for diversity seeking returned, which means there is hope that you can bring people back to a diversity seeking frame once you turn the algorithms off. The other example is the redirect method that was implemented by Google, which was to use targeting against the radicalizers. So they would use targeting to try to find people who were searching using search terms that would indicate that they were trying to join the caliphate in ISIS. And then they would target them with anti-radicalization content to disrupt their journey to join the caliphate. And they found that this was really successful. So it's almost using the targeting of social media and the internet to create anti-radicalizing outcomes rather than radicalizing outcomes. So these two examples portend a lot of hope that if we approach this in a critically minded way, that we can actually make meaningful change.
Thank you for those examples. I did actually cast my net quite wide when I was organizing this to see if I could find any cybersecurity or other people to speak about actual de-radicalization in the context of social media. And I drew a blank. Probably don't move in the right circles. I'm sure some of you know people in various services who are thinking about that. But if there is anything hopeful to share, please do let us know at some point.
Yasmin Green and Jacob Cohen, both people you might look to there.
Michael Jensen at the University of Maryland as well. He leads the START program, the domestic terrorism program here in the United States. There are some very good people, but it's early days on this question. De-radicalization is not something we've looked into, and we used to be worried about ISIS, and now we're worried about Instagram. So that's quite a leap from one thing to the other.
I'm just going to throw in here that it's Michael Jensen, but Kat is Norwegian, so you've said Jensen.
Oh,
I'm glad
it's okay.
Such a diverse panel. Okay. Are there any questions from our audience? There is nothing outstanding in the Q&A. So if anybody is out there who has a specific question, I can see that Leslie Carr has a raised hand, and I'm hoping that Ian might be able to spotlight Leslie. And two participants have raised hands. I think we had hoped you would put your questions in our Q&A. I'm not sure if we can work with raised hands. Ian, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Les can talk.
Okay. Les?
Okay, sorry, I wasn't quite sure about the messaging there. I'd like, if I may, to ask the kill Hitler question. So perhaps if I could transport you back to 2004 and ask you, sort of what if you do you have a proposal for what intervention you could make that would have changed the landscape? Perhaps not solved all the problems, but just back in the days of Friendster and GeoCities and RSS feeds, how could you have untilted the playing field, or sort of, yes, unbiased the tech or the economics or the politics, so that we would have ended up in a different place?
Gosh, okay. The only person smiling is Sinan.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of things we could have done then and we can still do today, which would be helpful. I'm not so sure that, I mean, I think they would have all been more helpful in 2004 than they will today because, you know, we've got a lot of backing up to do. But, you know, I think that the main solutions are these money code norms and laws, starting with competition, having, by the way, any kind of regulation has to have real teeth. This notion of these drops in the bucket, you know, fines that these companies pay, which they're gladly paying because, you know, they make it back, you know, in a week in the increase in stock price. And so any regulation has to have real meaningful financial teeth. But I think competition policy, merger oversight, interoperability, social network and data portability legislation, I think that real meaningful legislative answers to drawing lines between free and harmful speech. Obviously, you know, the First Amendment in the United States is not sacrosanct in the sense that sometimes it contravenes the 14th Amendment. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are certain public harms that require regulation of speech. And I think that there are ways to do that while still preserving the marketplace of ideas and not going overboard. All of these things would have been more useful in 2004 before a lot of the missteps, but would still be useful today. Also, I think that obviously the code, I talk at length in the book about what I call the hype loop, which is the dynamic interplay of machine intelligence and human behavior, where the machine optimizes its recommendations based on some objective function to maximize profits. And then we're fed those recommendations and we make choices based on what we're given. And then our choices are fed back into the machine. And this is a never-ending loop of optimization. But the algorithms themselves could be rewritten with different objectives, not just maximize engagement, but other objectives that would also bring society's values into the equation, not just the profit maximizing values. And the last thing I'll say about that is that you would think that you know, a lot of people who are, you know, free market capitalists say, well, you know, an executive's only duty is to maximize shareholder value. But the argument that I make in the book is that the true leaders of the new social age will be the ones who realize that the way to maximize shareholder value is to align shareholder value with society's values, because the backlash in loss of people who are fleeing these companies who no longer want to work for them, the advertisers that are no longer happy with their ads being served next to fake or harmful content, and also the regulatory backlash, which is imminent, is not a sustainable model for these companies, even from a profit-seeking perspective long-term. So I think that once the leaders of the new social age reveal themselves, the true leaders who realize, wait a minute, we have to align our company's values with society's values if we hope to have sustainable growth in the future, that's when real meaningful change will come.
Would anybody else like to answer that same question, or shall I move on? We have three other questions coming up.
If I could just one small thing, is that just from the Select Committee investigation, I think a lot of the problems we talked about in the inquiry really stem from changes, certainly at Facebook, that were made around 2014. It was the kind of creation of the lookalike audiences, the custom data audiences that made ad targeting much more effective, much easier to use data to find, you know, the title of Charles' film says people, you know, people you may know, people like you. And what Cambridge Analytica demonstrated was the power that could have in politics in particular, and in ideas, where you could target people based on emotions and ideas that they had. And that wouldn't really have been possible before some of those ad tool changes came in. It was also at the same time that Facebook started to do deals with companies around the amount of data they would have access to, depending on the value of their commercial relationship, to change Facebook logging to make it more data acquisitive, to acquire more data of what people did off of Facebook to improve the targeting of people when they were on Facebook. A lot of those changes, which ended up being quite fundamental, are not that old. And I think there's a direct correlation between many of the problems that we talk about now and those changes being made.
And if I could just add 30 seconds on to that, you know, if I could kill a Hitler, as the metaphor was put, I would go a little bit earlier than that, and perhaps go back to when some of what Sinan addresses, the idea when it became inscribed into law that a CEO's primary obligation was to increase shareholder value, which forced companies into thinking quarterly rather than thinking long term. And I would go back to weakening the fairness doctrine within the Federal Communications Commission as well, which has given us things like Fox News, which were the precursor to a lot of the online media that we have. And I think those two things were so devastating to the media environment. They planted a lot of seeds for what was to come.
Great. Okay, there are 3 more questions. I hope you have a few more minutes to try and answer them. Are there reliable ways to distinguish between content that is patently fake versus genuine content that comes from a different worldview or culture? It's well possible that the worldview could itself be based on falsehoods. That's from Srinath.
Well, just a very quick answer to this. This is something that I raised in a TED Talk a couple of years ago. And that's the idea that people think that the solution to this should be easy, that there should be some sort of technical solution. But if you scratch at the surface away from all the legislative questions of regulation, the questions of how do you change the algorithms and so on, underlying all of that when it comes to fake news is the question, who gets to decide what's true and what's false? And that is a very difficult philosophical question. That's not going to be answered by a computer scientist. That's not going to be answered by an economist. That's going to require philosophy. That's going to require collaboration and cooperation at a global scale. I don't have a great answer to that question. Is it Facebook? Should Facebook get to decide what's true and what's false? Is it the government? Is it the government? Is it a local government, you know, that should get to decide what's true and what's false? Or is it a consortium of fact checkers internationally? And if so, then who's checking the fact checkers? This is not an easy question. I really appreciate whoever raised it.
I think if I could just add to that as well, I think in reality, whatever is done in this space is going to have to be fairly black and white. You know, you can't have a system where you try and regulate political speech. You know, we're used to an environment where, you know, 2 politicians could both use perfectly well-sourced, credible facts to argue totally contrary positions on the same issue. You know, if you have a debate about is the economy doing well or not, you know, 2 politicians could use it, and they can give everything they're saying is well sourced, but it presents 2 completely contradictory arguments. So you can't go into regulating that. But I think what we've got to think about is saying, you know, if someone produced a deepfake film or a politician saying something they never said and ran it as an ad to try and undermine them in an election campaign, do we have the right to go to the tech companies there and say, look, we can know this is a fabricated piece of content. It's malicious. It's got a clear intent to disturb the election. We think something should be done about that. And I think, and at the moment, we don't have that ability. At the moment, we would be entirely within the hands of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, whether they agreed that a deepfake film should be removed. And indeed, we've seen, you know, both YouTube and Facebook have responded differently to those same issues recently as well. And I think, you know, so I think that there are sort of important issues like that. And I think it's more, I think other than that, it's more questions of saying, say somebody was putting out false information to say the water supply of the city had been poisoned. You know, or, you know, do we have the right to intervene there when we know that's plainly not true, or that the virus is killed, or as we've had with COVID, that, you know, the COVID vaccine is responsible for killing 500 people in a village in Africa. You know, well, we know that is not true, but, you know, so I think the issues is with these quite extreme versions of disinformation, which in themselves could lead to influencing people's behavior in a way that could cause them and other people harm. I think that's the I think that's the sort of territory we're realistically going to be in. Not saying that, you know, because I think that politician got their percentages wrong in that tweet they put out, that they should be cancelled. I don't think that's a world we can be in.
Okay, a couple more quick questions.
Actually, could I just ask,
Sure.
Damian, a quick question for you on that exact point, which is, what have you seen the there's a interesting video which makes it harder to sort of address the point you just made, which is the quote unquote drunk Pelosi video. Have you seen this video?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's essentially just a slowed down version of Nancy Pelosi speaking. And the argument is that this is satire. It is, you know, a filmmaker's, you know, desire to, you know, use editing tools to just sort of like change slightly and have a funny video out there, clearly targeted at making Nancy Pelosi look bad, clearly falsified to make her look drunk. But how far do we go, even when it's political video or speech, clearly doctored, clearly intentional desire to cause political harm? But are we going to limit comedians, filmmakers, satirists, and people in general from editing videos, slowing down videos? How far do we go? Is it really black and white? Is it really that black and white? And where can we draw those lines?
I think that point on satire is one of the more complex areas. I think on the Pelosi film, I think that was malicious. I think in the YouTube took it down, but Facebook didn't, which also shows the fact there's no agreement even within the sector as to how you respond in that situation. I think the context is important. I think that was malicious film. The context was to present it as if it was real, that she was she was incapacitated, and I certainly think the sort of thing, if you're in an election period, that a regulator should take a view on, and certainly if it was being run as an ad, you know, I think again, a lot of the things actually due prominence as well. The response of companies like Facebook could be saying, well, we won't allow that film to be used in a targeted political ad by anybody, or, you know, we won't promote that film even if it may exist there. I think that this is why the sort of regulatory approach we're looking at in the UK is not unhelpful, because in the UK, regulators make these sorts of decisions with regards to broadcasting all of the time. And in fact, there are different rules on broadcasting political satire during election periods. You can't run, you know, you couldn't run the equivalent of Saturday Night Live in the UK during a general election. You know, so because you know, there are moratoriums put in place. But you know, leaving that aside, I think again, I think a regulator could be helpful in helping the companies get these decisions right and not leaving it just to them as well. In the same way that broadcasting regulators have to make decisions on, do they intervene in terms of grounds of taste and decency, you know, due impartiality for our news broadcasters. They have to make those decisions against a code every day. So I think it can be done, but I think we have to create the structures that make those sorts of decisions possible. And except we won't always get them right.
I'd love to add something.
Yes, our filmmakers.
I'd love to add something to that, Lucy, just to the effect of something we've seen creating this film. And it's that the creators of this kind of disinformation content are extremely agile, and they are extremely good at adopting the language of different factions. So Sinan, you were mentioning, you know, if I say that, well, I'm a filmmaker, I'm happy to make a film of Nancy Pelosi however I want. And, you know, you thinking she's drunk, that's your opinion. And what we've seen within this very targeted community is that they're super effective at adopting the language of the right or the left, or say a filmmaker or the arts and culture world. So we've seen them using phrases like sovereignty, which really, really rings true with a lot of conservatives because it's, you know, minimal government interference, minimal interference in your life. So they're talking about body sovereignty when it comes to the vaccine, for example, and body choice. When it comes to the left, they're appealing to them with things like gaslighting and saying, you can't gaslight me into adopting the narrative of the CDC or whoever it is that they're fighting against. So this kind of agile language adaptation is something that really needs looking at, because they're fast, and you see it in terms of QAnon content being taken down as well. Well, they'll call the video QAnon moms, or they'll call it something slightly different so that it won't get taken down immediately.
Oh, lots of treats in store. I mean, all I can say, and especially to Damian, is I hope Ofcom is up to the job and we're going to do some training up. The next question is from Mike Ward. How can you protect children and treat them differently than adults? I'm going on mute because my dog's barking.
Right. Well, just to say, we do already treat children differently, and the Age Appropriate Design Code in the UK, sets different standards, not just for the sorts of tools that children should be used to, but even that some of the design systems should be different for children, so that they're less aggressive in terms of data acquisition and give more protections to protect the user as well. So I think it's very important that we do have different standards for children. The big decision, which we've not really got right, is how do you enforce age verification online? The systems that the companies have in place are based on self-declaration. And indeed, we looked at this on the select committee, on Instagram, for example, if you put in your age as being under 13, you can't set up an account. But if you have another girl on the same computer, straight afterwards, you say you're 15 instead of 12, you set an account up. So there is no system of age verification that exists. And I think these are, and there are reasons why it's hard for children, but I think we need to start thinking about some of these things. And I personally think when we talk about online safety, I think one of the issues we will get into really fast will be the way that things like the For You on TikTok works, the way data is being used to recommend, potentially harmful content to very young children on social media as a routine thing. And I think that is something we should be more concerned about. And I think we will. I think when the online safety debate opens up, I think that is something that will come to the fore a lot more.
I think with what Sinan has said earlier about that we need whole society solutions for a lot of these problems. This is not something that just legislators are going to be able to solve, nor just big tech companies. We need to inform and educate parents about what they need to look for and how they might handle different things. Inform and educate children as well around critical thinking skills around what's available online.
It was interesting, something Charles and I discussed on the podcast a while ago is, I was quite interested in, I think it's to do with facial recognition technology in Washington State. There's a new state law being passed that says that before you can launch a new product, it has to have gone through sort of sandbox trials so you can demonstrate how it works, what the potential unforeseen consequences of the tech are. And again, that's, I think, for some sensitive things, certainly things that younger people use, and that's quite an interesting idea to say, as in many other industries, you have to put your product through testing before you can launch it.
Sure, absolutely, and you can't rely on crowdsourcing to find the dangers that are there as well. If McDonald's were having a crisis of cleanliness in their kitchens, if they said, okay, look, we'll solve this problem, but it might take us 10 years. But meanwhile, perhaps when you come around as a customer, you can look around, and if you see that it's dirty, let us know, and we'll do something about it. And we wouldn't accept that in any way at all.
I'm going to ask Sinan to answer this question because I know he's very hard line with screen time for children in his own house. I think you said earlier you weren't very keen on identity verification and possibly age verification. How do you feel your views relate to this question about children?
I didn't say that about age verification. There are lots of situations in which we want age verification. What I am not necessarily keen on is universal identification. I think that there are situations around the world where anonymity allows minority voices a voice, and where universal identification will contribute to authoritarian crackdowns against minority voices. And I could give examples of that. But when it comes to children and screen time, I think that this needs to be a sort of holistic approach. I don't think that there is a one change to sort of law or code that's going to solve this problem. I think it begins with education. I think our children experience a completely different reality than the one that we grew up in. So it was perhaps surprising to hear that Steve Jobs didn't let his kids use the iPad and the iPhone because he understood what the impacts of this kind of technology are on young brains. We're also living through a very difficult time. So as you said, my son did not get a lot of screen time pre-pandemic, but then he was forced to do his entire schooling online. Now he can fix my computer. There was a sea change in his reality because of the pandemic and because of the need to conduct education virtually, which threw a wrench into any parent's plans around screen time. But I think that we can design our education systems to prepare our children for a life lived online, to give them the tools to cope with the peer pressure that happens, to be able to spot falsity. There are games being developed that teach kids how to tell truth from falsity online, gamifying the education that would be necessary to be more critical consumers of information online, understanding how to spot signs of bullying or manipulation and so on. So I think it begins with preparing our kids rather than sort of banning or making them unable to use technology. I believe that technology is agnostic. I think that it can be used for good or evil. I think that we need to prepare our kids to achieve and realize the promise of new digital technologies and avoid their peril. In fact, I think we have to get past this debate about whether social media is good or evil, because the answer is yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I know that Damian's very interested in digital media literacy in schools, but we do not have time to go there. Our very last question from the audience, which I promised to ask from Pushkal, is what are your views on online harm specific to MPs? Does this make it harder for politicians to engage more on social media?
Well, no, not at all. Depends what you're going to say, doesn't it, I suppose? But I think if you look at the suspension of Donald Trump's account, social media accounts, I think what that says is that even the President of the United States can't incite an insurrection on social media. There are limits to what even the President of a country can do and say if what they're saying is going to cause harm. But I don't think you should edit their political judgments. And indeed, politicians make statements, they get things wrong. And part of the political process you learn pretty quickly as a politician is you're held to account for what you say. So is that actually, if a politician makes a mistake and posts about it, actually that material existing as part of a debate about whether they are honest, reliable, on top of the facts is important, I think, as a statement of public record. But if they start encouraging people to, fight like hell and join a sort of obeying mob, then there are actions that can be taken against them too. So I think social media has become the place where communities do politics. I know from my own experience that if people want to get together to protest against a road being built or to campaign for the local swimming pool to be improved or whatever it is, they organize on social media. They get campaigns going on social media. It's become central to the political debate. And that's why I think we should take what happens on it quite seriously and recognize that it can do an awful lot of good in terms of engagement and making politicians accessible, but it can also be used in a bad way as well. And I think that's the lesson of the inquiry that we led that was one of the key things. I think is recognizing the way in which data targeting and profiling dark ads can lead to the spread of lies, disinformation, and hate, and often not done by mainstream political parties and candidates, but slightly shadowy campaign organizations where it's hard to identify who they really are. And those are things we should be concerned about. We have rules in place to try and make sure that politics is done in a way that's open and honest and fair and transparent. And we need to make sure as best we can that translates online too.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very, very much for your time. I'm going to ask one last very quick question, which is, I anticipate there are various researchers and academics in this audience, and if you could design any experiment of your dreams or any piece of research at this point in our understanding of social media and its effects, what would it be if you haven't already done it?
I'll chuck mine in. But,
Go on, go for it.
we're talking about already. We don't have good access to the algorithms that drive recommendation tools on social media, and I think a piece of research that shows this is how a social media company can shape the online experience of people of different ages and different backgrounds, and shape what they see. You know, there's been some research on that, but I think to look at to understand the power of the algorithms and recommendation tools, I think will be really interesting.
Sinan, do you think any of the platforms would allow you to do that?
I think yes, but yes and no. I mean, I think that historically they have been not transparent at all. It's been very difficult to get access to data, very difficult to get access to causal data. So where you do experiments, that's, you know, everybody now has heard the moniker that correlation is not causation. So when you find a correlation between fake news and some election outcome, doesn't mean that the fake news contributed to some change in the election. What we really need to understand is exactly what Damian is outlining, is experimental evidence that shows what the causal effect of recommendation algorithms, of targeting, and so on are. There have been some examples of access, but they've been few and far between. And so what I call for pretty strongly in the book is much more transparency, that we need to open these platforms up to really look under the hood of how these algorithms work to affect our democracies, our economies, and our public health, and much more. And, you know, I hesitate to answer this question because I have about 50 different experiments I would want to run, 20 of which we're already running, and the other, you know, 30 of which we hope to run, and, you know, are facing all of the challenges that researchers are facing with regard to access.
Okay, Charles and Kat, anything?
Well, I think that transparency is the theme here for sure, and it's necessary for academic researchers, but also for legislators and so on. But what I would really like to understand is, as we have all of these platforms that have been designed based on behavioral design, to what degree are we now changing behaviors? And are we in fact impacting the evolution of our society and of us as human beings as we reinforce a lot of these behaviors?
Sinan?
For me, oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
Kat, go for it. Sorry.
Oh, well, I would just say, as the only non-academic on the panel and a filmmaker and millennial, I would say, you know, a film, of course, and the power of film over an academic study is to tell an emotional story. And I think emotional stories are so important. We see, you know, there's great information out there, but it doesn't necessarily penetrate the general population. And to reach the general population, we need to tell them a story that will resonate with them in order to affect change. So it comes from the level up from the academic studies, from politicians, from legislation, and trickling all the way down to, you know, how do I persuade Uncle Joe, who has been in QAnon now for the last year?
Well, unless you want to come back on that, Sinan, I will just urge everybody to watch People You May Know. It is an emotional roller coaster in more ways than one. And it leaves me just the opportunity to thank the panel very much for their time in New York, in Alabama, in London. I don't know where you are, Kat, so I can't add that in. And
she's on the porch.
On the porch. Thank you very much to the Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton. And if you've enjoyed this talk and you feel you'd like more, do register for the conference that's next week. That's the Web Science Conference. The panels are very, very accessible. And we'd love to see you there. Once again, to thank the panels and to thank all the audience for turning up on such a hot night, at least in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.